Welcome to the Cornell Cooperative Extension Dairy Herd Health Troubleshooting Podcast, a podcast series focused on how to go about looking into health issues on a dairy. Each episode will discuss a different area on the dairy where herd health can be impacted. This series has less to do with providing answers to problems. We'll be talking about how to be more successful in your investigations.
Welcome to the Weaning transition episode of Troubleshooting Herd Health Issues. Hi, I'm Melanie Palmer from the South Central Dairy Field Crops Regional Team. And joining me today is Betsy Hicks. She's also from the South Central Dairy Regional Team, and Margaret Quaassdorff from the Northwest Regional Dairy and Field Crops Team. Today, the three of us are going to talk about troubleshooting challenges that calves face through the weaning transition period. Ladies, when producers contact you about problems with their transition calves, what are some of the issues they face?
Thanks, Mel. This is Betsy. I guess I'll go first. So sometimes producers call when calves don't look as good as they did before they were weaned. Some people might call them some crappy looking calves. Sometimes people call about respiratory disease, and it always seems to hit in that first pen right after they wean calves. Margaret, how about you? What do people call you for?
Betsy, like you said, I get a lot of calls about respiratory issues. It's definitely a common issue, but it's not really something that should be normal. They might not recognize that they have calves that get sick at the time of transition, and maybe they had been sick before or during the pre-weaning stage, and they're getting it again. But some farms have just come to expect that this is just part of the transition weaning process. It's just stressful and the calves get sick, but really the long-term effects that accepting this as a normal practice are significant and can be detrimental to the farm's bottom line, as well as the welfare of the animals and even the caretakers of the animals on the farm.
Well, we certainly know that weaning causes a lot of stress on these calves, and we need to look out for health issues, certainly. Some of the symptoms we can visibly look for are coughs, runny manure, decreased appetite. Maybe if we check some temperatures on a calf that really doesn't look very good for abnormal temperatures, and just total unthriftiness. And we also know too that there might be some growth limitations during this time. There's quite a diet change for these calves. They've gone from a pretty much all liquid diet to now to an all solid diet. And this is their main source of nutrients. So we need to make sure that we get that feed into them. And we need to make sure we watch them to make sure that they are up and eating. And they've now got some competition. Maybe they were in individual hutches, so they were the one and only and had all their feed in front of them, and they didn't have to share with their neighbors. And now they've got that group pen situation, and they've got some competition for feed. So we've got to keep watch. We need to keep track of them and make sure that everybody's up and eating like they should be. And just a side tip, it might not hurt to do some post-wean body weights, maybe a week to 10 days after you've put them in the weaning pen, to check their weights and make sure they're not going backwards.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about a lot of strategies and things we check throughout this episode. 4 main areas are what we're going to look at, though. We're going to look at housing and facility. We're going to look at social and behavioral changes and things to troubleshoot in that area. We're going to talk a little bit about nutrition, and we're going to talk a little bit about management and things that we do to manage these calves. So I guess, Margaret, let's start with housing and facility. So when people call you about problems with their transition weaning calves, what things are you looking at in their housing and facility?
Yeah, so one of the things that I like to look at first when I come on a farm is, are the calves in the transition pen overcrowded? So typically what we're shooting for is 30 square feet or more of bedded space per calf, not including the service alleys. And the reason why we're looking at this is because it has a lot to do with air quality and is based on airborne bacterial density studies. And I know Betsy has some more to add about ventilation a little bit later on. But from some recent data that Betsy, myself, and another colleague have gathered from some farms across New York State, about 75% of the farms that we looked at are actually not hitting this goal of 30 square feet or more per calf. And it's giving them some trouble in their transition pens. So a way that you determine that square footage per calf on your farm is to measure, and you can use a laser measure, that works great, or a wheel measure or tape measure if you want to do a lot of adding in the end, but measure the length and width of the bedded space for your calves, and then multiply those numbers together and divide by the number of calves that you have in that group. Some spaces are weird shapes, so you can do the different sections however it's easiest to measure and then add those up. But if you have less than 30 square feet per calf, it might be worth looking into how to reduce either the number of the calves in that pen or create more space in that pen for those calves. If you're building new, make sure you've done this calculation for your desired group size. I personally like 8 or 10 calves, but I've seen up to 12 do well with some really good management. The other thing is, how comfortable are calves in their space? And I think Mel's going to talk more on that. Mel, do you want to expand upon that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Margaret. Bedding. Bedding is a key item when we're talking about housing for these babies. We need to make sure we provide them dry bedding and enough bedding. There certainly are times, and I've seen some situations where enough bedding would be a real luxury. I'd just be glad to see that there was some dry bedding under some of them. But the key thing is to make sure it's dry and enough. We are dealing with a new environment for these calves, so they now have got a different pathogen load and a new pathogen exposure. So they've got to get their immune systems built up. It's a good thing if prior to moving a new batch into the weaned pen, that we can get into that pen, get it cleaned out and disinfected from the previous group. That will help with the pathogen load in that area for the new group. Manure removal. Certainly we want to keep our pens cleaned out routinely. And we want to make sure, because of some of the diseases that can be on a farm for these animals, and some of them can be transmitted from the older cows to the young calves, we want to make sure that when we're cleaning, we're always going from youngest to oldest, never from the oldest animals down to the younger animals with manure. So we want to make sure that we do that in a routine. And we also have to consider water. These animals need a good, clean source of water, fresh water. And if they've got waters, we need to make sure that the waters are cleaned out. I've seen some pretty gummy waters in my time. There's a lot of opportunity for the calves that go over with a mouthful of feed and then they get a drink of water. So they can get built up with feed in the water. So we need to keep monitor on them. And we also have to remember too that these calves are now sharing their water. So we need to make sure that there's enough waters in there, that there's enough space for all of the calves to get to. Betsy, what else?
Yeah, great points, ladies. So those two things, I think, are things that we can monitor and measure and visually see. When we talk about ventilation and the type of housing, how do you assess ventilation? You know, we can assess when we have poor ventilation, right? We can monitor the coughing and heavy breathing and things like that. But like, how do we really assess ventilation? So there's a few different things that we can do to troubleshoot. First off, our counterparts up in Northern New York have done a lot more of this, but fogging barns, you can go out and buy these smoke sticks that last, either 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, to go out there and fog barns and visually see how are our air tubes, how are our positive pressure tubes performing? How are our fans performing in the summertime? Is air actually being brought in? Is air being dispersed the way it should? So we can assess ventilation. Those smoke sticks are like an awesome, cheap way to go out and see what is going on in your barns. In the summertime, I'm thinking about, are we bringing in enough fresh air and getting air exchanges? So we can do some measurements on the inlets, air coming in, we can measure air speed. And then in the wintertime, we're also going to do those things, but obviously we don't need as much air exchange as we do in the summertime. And really with those young calves, I'm still thinking about, do they have a draft on them? I don't want a draft, but I do want fresh air. So I'm going to assess things a little bit differently in the summertime as I do in the wintertime.
Those certainly were some great points on the housing and the facilities. So let's take a look at some of the potential social and behavioral issues that these weaned calves face. Margaret, why don't you get us started?
Yeah, so when I'm troubleshooting, I'm going to be looking at the size of calves in the group and also the difference in sizes of the calves and seeing if this could be a contributing factor to some of the issues that we're having. We really want to keep our calves within 1 month or so of age of each other in this transition pen. And this is going to be a lot easier for larger farms than it is going to be for smaller farms, depending on the number of calves that you have moving through your system. But we also want to make sure that there's a weight range of less than 100 pounds. And that's because we don't want our smaller calves to have a harder time competing with our larger ones at this stage. This is not the time where you want your smaller calves to lose ground. because theoretically they should be entering the transition group ready to thrive. We don't want to knock them down right off the bat when they're trying to learn all these other different things. Betsy, do you have any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, my personal opinion, and it's anecdotal, but really my personal opinion is everybody needs a buddy, right? So when I was first starting in the dairy industry, I worked on a farm that group housed their calves, and they group house them in groups of 4. And it was amazing to see when everybody had a buddy, whether it was 4 calves or 2 calves in a pair, everybody did great. But once you had an odd number, it was like the odd man out, like 2 calves laid together and that third one was like on its own. So we always tried to do 4 or 2, everybody getting a buddy. We do see in research that pair housing calves before weaning does improve the transition. So that is a strategy that some farms are starting to implement to help with that transition. But really, I'm going to focus on, are calves getting thrown too many changes at once through this transition? When removing them, are we changing their diet? Are we changing how they have to drink water? Are we going from a bucket to now they have to learn a ball feeder? So if we're changing one thing, let's not change another thing. A lot of farms are just throwing too many changes to these calves when we're group housing, throwing vaccinations, maybe dehorning, location, feed. Just try to do one change at a time. Let them learn how to do one thing at once.
Yeah, Betsy, I agree. I kind of throw a couple of the things into almost like survival factors for these calves because they do have new things to learn. I'll touch on a couple of the kind of priority ones. First one would be eating. We've got to make sure that they are able to find food, that they do find the food and the water. Like we've indicated before, they're transitioning from possibly their own individual buckets to now a trough or a manger area and also shared waters. So they've got that competition factor now. Some of them may be literally like fighting for feed, and the dominant ones are going to be the dominant ones, and the other ones that are not the dominant ones, they're going to have to find their time where they can get up to that feed and eat. So we need to be aware of that and watch for that. The other thing would be is making sure that we don't kick these babies into a stall too early because that's something more that they need to learn. Like Betsy just indicated, how many things can we throw at them at once that they need to learn? So maybe keeping them on a bedded pack at least until they're 5-6 months old before we introduce stalls to them. Prior to 5 to 6 months old might be a little bit too soon for a successful transition. So what is our next area of concern when troubleshooting issues?
Yeah, thanks, Mel. I just have one more thought on that, on the stall size. It's so important that the stalls are really appropriately sized because stalls that don't fit the animal can injure heifers, especially if the heifers are too large for small stalls, or even if they're undersized for those stalls, they may get stuck in a different way and injure themselves. And also, smaller calves kind of learn that they can run through stalls that are kind of too big, which is a behavior that's learned and can be carried over throughout their life. So just like you said, it's important to appropriately match the size of the calf to the stall and to wait until they might be old enough to be able to do that. But the next thing I want to talk about is nutrition. And I think we're going to start talking about weaning and some of the issues that happen towards the end of weaning, or if animals are weaned too quickly or too soon. So one of the most frustrating things is when you have these beautiful bouncing calves in hutches or pens, and you wean them and you move them, and all of a sudden they don't look so good. Besides the too many changes at once that may have caused this, are we specifically certain that these calves were eating enough starter grain for long enough to sustain their growth through this transition? That's something that we need to ask ourselves. A lot of times we run out of space in our pre-weaned barn or hutches, and especially after a calving slug, or what I like to call a cavalanche, which for some reason always comes around Thanksgiving and Christmas on all the farms that I've worked on. So we start to feel the pressure to wean and move these calves towards the end of January or February. And at this time it's cold and the calves need to be eating a lot of grain in order to stay warm and put on some pounds. This is not the time that we want to rush them through the system. They're also still developing those rumens, which will help them stay warm and continue to grow, but that takes time. Betsy, can you tell us a little more about the feeding scenarios we run into with these transition calves?
Yeah, a lot of times I see farms, when that first pen after weaning, when they're putting them in group pens, they like to give them TMR. And you think about this baby calf, she's been on starter. Maybe she's had a little bit of nice soft grass hay, but she's been eating starter. That's her main source of solid food that she's been eating. And so tossing this new fermented feed at them, they don't know what it is. It smells funny to them. And it's just a completely different texture than they're used to. And so I really don't like getting TMR in front of these weaned calves right away. I'm happy to wait to 5-6 months for these calves to see their first TMR, honestly. The other thing I see farms really just putting all the hay in front of them that they want. And really, does that hay offer all the nutrients that that calf needs to grow and thrive and do all those things that you're talking about, Margaret? We really want to make sure that we have a balanced diet for these girls. That starter intake probably is pretty darn good for that calf when she's first weaned. She knows how to eat it. She knows what it is. She's getting a lot of other things thrown at her. Let's just keep her on that starter and put some nice soft grass hay in front of her too. Oh, one last thing about when we're going to group housing, I forgot to bring it up. A lot of times we make calves learn headlocks too in this first pen. I hate that. Let's just use the feed rail. If we have to, we can use slant bars, but let's not make them try and learn a headlock on top of that too. If we're going to change feed, definitely don't make them learn a headlock too. Mel, what else do you have?
Well, I'm going to touch on water again. When it comes to nutrition, we know that water is a nutrient for these girls. And so we need to make sure that we've got a fresh, clean supply, good quality and readily available water for the calves. We need to make sure that there's enough waters there for the number of animals that we've got, because we've got to remember that competition factor. And as we're hitting now in the middle of coming up on winter, not too far away as we look out the window, we need to make sure, unless you've got heaters on your waters, we need to check every day. It doesn't take too much of a colder night and you can have that water or ice over. So you got to make sure that that is broken open if it does freeze over, and make sure that they have access to water all of the time.
Yeah, for sure. It's this time of year, it's hard enough. And then we're not even into the cold part yet.
Exactly.
Yeah. So for our last topic in this episode, we're going to talk about management. So let's scoot right into that. So absolutely, my biggest pet peeve with management is that very few farms actually have scales and track their growth rates. It just bugs me to no end that we don't know what calves weigh. We're guessing at weights. And not tracking that leads us to make some really poor decisions about how we're managing them. So Mel, is anything that bugs you in specific about managing transition calves?
Well, I'm back to the cleanliness thing again, and to make sure that all areas are kept clean for these babies, whether it's their bedded pack and especially their feeding area, where they eat. Are they eating at a trough? Are they eating in a manger type area? We need to keep all of those areas clean. In warm weather, it doesn't take long and we can have moldy feed. How many of us have ever seen maggots in feed, really? Okay. I'm sure that all of us have. So we need to make sure we remove any old feed frequently and that there's no access to get manure into that feed. I was on a farm one time where they had their weaned group in a bedded pack, and there was a concrete area where they ate from, and there was a board there, obviously, so they couldn't come through. But the board didn't go flush to the concrete, so the calves were actually able to step up on the edge of the concrete that was on the inside of the pen, and then they would put their heads through and eat. Well, they ended up with some trouble with coccidiosis, and it ended up with a vet call. And the vet came and looked at the situation and said, well, you know what? Those calves are standing on the edge of the feed. Manure is getting into the feed. They're consuming that feed with their manure. And so the cycle of the coccidiosis was just continuing. It didn't take much as far as management practices to correct that. It meant putting one more board down flush to the concrete so their feet could not touch the feed. It was a critical thing, but it was a simple fix. We need to be aware of those things and be watching for those things as we look at these calves and make sure that they stay on track. We certainly know that there are Band-Aids out there. There's crumbles that you can feed, especially for like coccidiosis, pneumonia, that kind of thing. But I prefer that we look at prevention versus treatment, because if we're in prevention mode, then that means the calf is going to remain healthy. If we're going to do the Band-Aid thing, that means that calf got sick or the calves got sick. And then you have to get them back on track. You have to get them over their disease, whatever it is, and then you have to get them back on track again, because most likely they're going to go backwards during that sick time. So let's look at prevention rather than treatment. And that means just keeping track of the feed area, of the pen area, keeping clean of manure, dry bedding, clean waters.
Margaret, how about you? Any pet peeves from your end?
Oh, yes. Probably one of my biggest pet peeves is feed push-ups, or actually lack thereof. We're trying to develop a rumen and gain some pounds here, and it takes a lot of nutrients to put on that much tissue. Not only does lack of inadequate feed push-ups directly affect potential growth and the nutrients needed for the immune system to function, but not having feed directly in front of these hungry heifers causes them to reach for it. And they will exert a huge amount of pressure against a curb, neck rail, or headlock in order to get to that feed. If you can picture it, in order to reach further, a heifer has to splay her front feet, kind of like a giraffe drinking, but against a concrete barrier. What this causes is compromised bone growth and foot integrity, and poor conformation that will stick with them the rest of their lives in the herd, which could actually be shortened due to poor feet and legs. And this, of course, is completely preventable with proper facility design and keeping that feed within reach. Betsy, what else do you have?
I guess we'll finish it out just reiterating what Mel said about Band-Aids. So rather than Band-Aiding and feeding crumbles and trying to get a group of calves over a stress point, every group of calves shouldn't be facing the same stress point when they get into that age point of their life. So I really want farms to back up and do some ultrasounding of lungs when we're talking about respiratory issues. The Weaning system from the University of Wisconsin, it's a great program for tracking calves and really isolating where our problems are coming from. It's really a troubleshooting tool for getting respiratory under control. And then vaccination protocols. I really encourage farms to work with your vet to make sure your protocols are up to date and to make sure your protocols are going to get done. There's one farm we work with that she said, you know what, this protocol is just too much for me. I'm trying to catch up heifers every week for 3 different types of shots, and it's just too much. It's not realistic. So work with your vet to make sure that you have a realistic protocol that you're actually going to do. And sometimes there's new and better vaccinations out there that can help with a certain issue. Definitely, it's time management. We can figure out more efficient ways to do things so that our heifers have the appropriate prevention that they need. So that's what I got.
Awesome. So we've talked a lot about different things today. And if you are having issues with your weaning transition, start with some of the items we mentioned today and work through the list to see if there can be any improvements made on your operation. Also, don't be afraid to reach out to your local Cornell Cooperative Extension dairy specialist for help in doing this and for other resources you might need.
Thanks for listening to this Herd Health Troubleshooting episode. You can find more episodes like this one on the CCE Dairy Educator channel on SoundCloud or on the ProDairy website, along with many other resources.